Three 90s point and shoots, one roll of Ektar 100 each. Today we're doing an unscientific comparison between the mega famous Yashica T4, the Olympus MJU II or Stylus Epic in the US, and finally the Ricoh R1. And yes, that last one, the Ricoh, is a bit of an outlier due to its 30mm lens compared to the 35mm lenses on the other two. But perhaps it's also surprisingly similar. Let's find out. All right, let's quickly go over each of the cameras, starting with these two. They're the most comparable. The Yashica T4 was released in 1992. It has a 35mm f3.5 lens, which is a bit slower than the MJU II, but it's a Carl Zeiss Tessar lens, so sharpness and contrast are its main selling points. It is a bit bulkier than the Olympus, with looks that are more distinctly early 90s. The Olympus MJU II was released in 1997. It has a 35mm f2.8 lens. It is very compact and has this nice clamshell design. Like the T4, it has a proper cult following. The MJU II is a bit special to me because it's the one that got me back into film photography in 2021. And I've shot some of my favorite photos on it. And then there's the Ricoh R1, which in this case is called the Rollei Prego Micron or Micron. For some reason, they loved different names for different markets back in the 90s. Anyway, it's got a 30mm f3.5 Schneider Kreuznach lens with a panoramic mode that drops to an actual 24mm by shifting the lens a bit. It's light, it's ergonomic, and it's often overlooked because everyone always talks about the way more famous and way more expensive Ricoh GR1. So, not gonna lie, I went into this comparison convinced that the Olympus would easily beat the R1 and would at least keep up with the T4. But it turns out I might have been wrong. Now let's look at how each camera performed during one weekend in Vilnius, Lithuania, with one roll of Ektar 100 each. In good daylight, golden hour, or overcast skies, all three of these cameras exposed accurately, for the most part, with only minor differences between them. The Olympus, by a tiny margin, produced the most pleasing color rendering. Slightly warmer, slightly softer, but overall very natural looking. The Ricoh leaned a bit cooler, while the T4 had the warmth of the Olympus, but was noticeably more contrasty. Sometimes that worked beautifully, but at times it felt a bit harsh, like overexposing this big boy's belly over here. The Olympus looks most pleasing to me with lots of detail in the highlights, but the background looks somewhat underexposed compared to the other cameras. In very high contrast scenes, the differences became even more obvious. The T4 retained both highlight and shadow detail. The Ricoh blew most of the highlights. The Olympus kept most detail in the highlights, but again, it tended to do so by slightly underexposing the shadow. The shot in between the two wagons, it really confirmed just how good the T4's metering can be. Overall though, outdoor in even daylight, it's a bit of a coin toss between all three, but definitely between the MJU II and the T4. In indoor portraits, however, the T4 was a clear winner. It generally came out sharpest with consistent autofocus. The R1 actually did fairly well too, but the Olympus was the least reliable, especially in terms of autofocus. And that matches my past experience with it. But seeing the difference side by side, it really highlighted that the MJU II is a bit 50-50 in these situations. And by the way, if you're interested in a full review of the Olympus MJU II, consider subscribing because I'll be posting that soon. In terms of vignetting, the R1 was definitely the most pronounced, by quite a bit, but I don't really mind it in a point and shoot. Adds a bit of character. Having said that, the T4 and the Olympus were a lot more controlled there. As for overall sharpness, the T4 is probably the sharpest, especially in the center. It just consistently delivered well-defined shots. The Olympus felt a bit softer, still perfectly usable and sometimes even a bit more flattering, but there is a difference when you compare them directly. So what about the Ricoh then? Well, surprisingly sharp. In some shots, I would even say it was the sharpest out of the three. That might be helped by its slightly punchier contrast, giving you the illusion of sharpness. But either way, it really impressed me a lot more than I expected. Now let's talk about how they feel in actual use. They're all mostly plastic fantastic, but the MJU II still feels the most refined. It's super compact and the buttons are responsive, especially the shutter button, the most important one of all, has a really satisfying and intuitive half-press click to it. And that silky black finish, it gives it a nice premium feel. The T4 feels more like a tool, and in my opinion, it doesn't look particularly elegant, but it does look solid. I did have one moment where the lens didn't extend properly. It sorted itself out after a restart, but it's not ideal and instantly kills my trust in the whole camera once something like that happens. So another minor gripe I have with the T4 is that the lens is weirdly placed far to the right, which kept making me think that my finger was blocking the lens. Don't know why they did that. The R1, despite being the cheapest of the three, is the most comfortable to carry and shoot with. It's light, it fits nicely in your hand, and it's very intuitive to use. It's also the only one with a front panel made of metal. That sounds great on paper, but it still feels a bit cheaper than the Olympus. I think that's down to the plastic on the rest of the body, which doesn't quite match the premium feel of the Olympus. It's just a bit thinner and a bit more creaky as well. And then there's the LCD. I specifically bought one with a broken LCD, as 90% of R1s out there today have a broken LCD. So this is most likely how you'll buy this one as well. But perhaps surprisingly, I don't think it's a fatal flaw on this camera. You can still shoot it perfectly fine without the display, as there's a separate LED indicator outside of the viewfinder that shows you whether your flash is on or off. And it's just one click of the rather chunky flash button at the top to switch your flash on or off, whereas it's 2 clicks on the MJU II, and it's a microscopic flash button, and 3 to turn the flash on the T4. I mean, 3 clicks. I much prefer the R1's big chunky flash button. So with that broken LCD, you'll lose some info and you'll have to guess a bit more, like, your shutter count, but it's still 100% usable without it. Unlike the T4's lens hiccup, which feels more unpredictable and definitely feels more fatal than the broken LCD on the R1, which honestly is something that you can live with. All right, let's talk price. The Olympus and Yashica, they're expensive. The Olympus MJU II typically sells for around $250 to $400, depending on its condition. I recently saw a nice one for about $210, which I think is fair. I bought this one for $170 in 2021. $400 or close to it, I think is a bit insane. The Yashica usually sells for about $300 to $450. Again, in that higher price range here, I think it's too pricey for what you're going to get. But you're going to get the Carl Zeiss lens. And what about the R1? Well, you can usually find one for about $150 to $230, even with a working LCD. I bought mine a few months ago for $120, but I think that might be because it's the Rolly version and it's just a bit lesser known. So keep an eye out for that one. Well then, what is the key takeaway? Who's the winner? Given how close the image quality is across all three, the price difference actually starts to matter quite a bit. Having said that, if you want the very best metering in tricky light and sharp, dependable results, the T4 is probably the top pick. But if you want very similar image quality, you're not made of money and don't mind a few quirks like the broken LCD on the R1, this is still a very strong contender. It's really not much of a compromise in terms of quality, and you even get that magic trick with the 24mm bonus lens. I honestly didn't expect it to do this well, but in many cases it was right up there with the other two, and sometimes even better. So none of these are bad choices, but for most people, I think the Ricoh is probably the one I'd recommend right now. Let me know which of these you'd go for, or if you have a sleeper favorite that didn't make it to the list. Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you'd like to see how each of these performs in more detail, I will be doing full reviews of all three, starting with the Olympus MJU II. So if you haven't already, consider subscribing because there is plenty more to come.